with old friends and new friends, and to welcome you to this roundtable that the Center for Policy Research, the Prayas Energy Group, and the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development have been hosting consecutively for the last 3 years, usually in person, but uncommon circumstances call for uncommon measures. So now we're doing this online, which means many, many more of us can be part of this discussion today, which is great. This initiative started as a way for us to get together and discuss the cutting edge issues that are on the horizon when we think about India's transitions, particularly in residences and the energy consumption that is coming with that. And it's no surprise that this year our focus and our theme is around the issue of cooling. So what we're going to do over the next day or two is have 6 researchers from very different backgrounds, very different locations, using different disciplinary lenses and methods, talk about their work either in progress or recently published on these aspects of cooling. And we're thinking about this in 2 broad ways. So today we're going to focus on the social and behavioral patterns related to space cooling in Indian households. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about the effectiveness of different policies and programs related to cooling and how those are panning out, particularly in terms of actual implementation. So the way it's going to work in terms of logistics is that we have 3 speakers today. They're going to get 15 minutes each to speak and 10 minutes after that for Q&A. You can type in your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and I will pick those up and bring them to the presenters after their 15 minutes are up. At the end of the 3 presentations, we will have about half an hour, 40 minutes for questions that couldn't be answered during the 10 minutes post-presentation. And so that's also a time for a broader discussion among the panelists, and you can type in your questions then as well. So keep using the Q&A box, and we'll be picking up those questions. Apart from that, this event is being live streamed on Facebook. It's also being recorded, and we're going to be tweeting about it from the different Twitter handles of the Center for Policy Research, Prayas Energy Group, and the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development. And I think that is it. So, and it's 4:05, which is exactly when we want to start. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna, who is at the Center for Policy Research, and she's going to start with her presentation on cooling and residentials in the Delhi region.
Thanks, Radhika. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the roundtable today. So I'll be presenting today about the changing cooling energy demand patterns across urban households in India. The findings I'll be presenting are based on a survey we did in Delhi last summer. This work is in collaboration with Radhika Khosla at University of Oxford, Nilanjan Sirkar at the Ashoka University, and Deepavali Chatterjee at the Center for Policy Research. This is the outline of the presentation. I'll start by talking about the study objectives and scope, then present some summary statistics on a sample. The findings of the survey are organized in a manner to answer these questions. What cooling appliances are people buying? How and why do people decide to purchase ACs? Who is purchasing a more efficient AC? And the role of women in decision-making around cooling. Finally, I'll present some key takeaways from the work and some policy recommendations. As you might note, most of the results I'll be talking about today focus on the question around purchase decisions of cooling appliances, particularly ACs. Our work also sheds insights on behaviors related to cooling appliances, but because of limited time, I would not get into the use aspects as much in this presentation. The research objective of our work is to identify ways to make India's rising residential cooling demand to be more energy efficient and low carbon. To do so, we focus on trying to understand household practices around cooling, how do urban households use cooling services, particularly air conditioning? How are these practices changing? How and why are households changing their cooling related use? And by understanding the household practices and their transitions, this work aims to provide policy recommendations that can help shape a low carbon cooling demand trajectory. A little bit about our sampling. Based on a University of Pennsylvania CASI study, we know the AC ownership patterns across Delhi. And from that work, we have picked clusters in Delhi where the AC penetration is 30% or more. From these clusters, which have this 30% or more AC ownership, we do a representative sampling of 2,000 households. Our sample consists of households that own AC, but also households that do not own an AC, which enables us to understand how cooling practices differ in these sets, in both sets of households. Just to emphasize here that the sample is representative of high AC owning areas in Delhi. The survey questionnaire is designed to get detailed information about household demographics and socioeconomic characteristics, the structural characteristics of the house, including room use. There's a roster on assets the household uses and the energy and cooling appliances. The survey goes into more details on the cooling appliances. On fans and coolers, we have questions around how many do the households own, how do they use it, are they branded, what's the star rating, etc. The AC, on the ACs, we get very detailed information on the type of technology, the purchase decisions. There are questions that help us understand usage of ACs. And then there are questions around decision making that help us understand who decides and what factors influence purchase and usage behaviors around cooling. The survey also helps understand more broadly the cooling behaviors and practices that the households have. For example, the non-AC cooling strategies or the electricity saving strategies that the households use when using an AC. And general awareness that the households have about the different energy efficiency schemes and their overall concern about the environment. Here are some summary statistics. The figure on the left gives the socio-economic characteristics of our sample of about 9,334 individuals of the total sample of about 2,092 households. About 48% of our sample is female. There are about 4 to 5 members per household, again 4 to 5 rooms in each house. The average age is about 34 years. 76% of the sample is in the working age group of 15 to 64 years. In this working age group, about 74% of the males are employed, while about 13% of the females are employed. And average reported monthly household income is about 12,500 rupees. The figure on the right shows the white good penetration in Delhi and compares the penetration in our sample to the Delhi average from the NSS survey. And you would note that overall the white goods penetration in our sample is much higher than the national average. Of course, the passage of time, but other than that, the sample being from the wealthier neighborhoods with higher AC penetration might sort of be leading to the higher penetration of TVs, refrigerators, washing machines. We can't compare the room air conditioners penetration to the Delhi average since NSS did not cover AC as one of the measures. Overall, about 43.4% of the households own an AC. Most of them own a single unit. 4% of the sample has 2 ACs and very few have 3 or more ACs. Now looking into what cooling appliances are people buying, we look at 3 appliances: fans, coolers, and ACs. Over 99% of the households own a fan. But what is interesting is that even in these wealthy neighborhoods, 18% of the households only own a fan and do not own a cooler or an AC, which really shows the heterogeneity of cooling energy use across the sample and across the households. And household owns multiple fans, on an average 2 to 3 fans. Over 85% of the fans are branded, with Usha being the most popular brand. The penetration of star-rated fans is quite low, it's around 7%. Coming to coolers, about 39% of the households have fans and coolers, but no ACs. 80% of the cooling owning households do not own an AC. And most houses have a single cooler, which they have purchased on an average in the last 4 years. Most of the coolers, about 88% of them, are not branded and are locally assembled. And when we look at price, the branded coolers are about 2 times the price of the unbranded coolers. On ACs, as I said, about 43% of the households have an AC. About 11% of the AC owning households have multiple ACs. And overall, 11% of the households in our sample have all 3 cooling appliances. That is, they have fans, coolers, and ACs. Some more information about the kind of ACs people are buying. So the figure on the left shows that both split and window ACs are quite popular, with the split ACs being slightly more popular than the window ACs. This figure in the middle shows that most ACs are newly bought. About 8% of the ACs were second-hand, and about 4% of the ACs were reported to be as gifted ACs. The figure on the right shows an average age of these ACs. So you would see that most of the ACs were bought in the last 3 years. The average age of the ACs is about 3 years. The gifted ACs are slightly older, overall indicating a relatively recent purchase of air conditioners. We find 90% of the ACs are branded. Voltas is the most popular brand with about a 25% share. The 1.5 tons capacity is the most popular choice in ACs. New ACs cost about 3.5 times the second-hand ACs, and average price of a new AC is about 30,000, whereas an average price of a second-hand AC was reported to be around 8,000 rupees. Most ACs, over 90% of them, allow for temperature adjustments, and 75% of them come with a remote. Trying to understand a little bit about how people are buying these ACs. And when we asked people the key factor that determined the particular AC selection, over 40% of the households reported that the brand of the company is the key factor in the AC selection. The features the AC has to offer is the second most popular factor that determines AC selection. To note here is that less than 5% of the households said that the star rating of the AC was the key factor in determining the AC selection decision. Overall, pointing to a low priority about energy efficiency and star rating amongst our sample. The figure on the right goes into who in the household decides on the purchase decision, and we find that in over 40% of the households, it's the head of the household or the mukhya who's the main decision maker. Usually, the mukhya is a middle-aged employed male member of the house. The head's offspring is also in 24% of the cases the main decision maker. 17% of the households reported making a joint decision on the purchase, and in cases of joint decision, again the mukhya is the primary decision maker. We find that 98% of the new ACs were purchased at a retail store. In comparison, second-hand ACs were bought from a local store or a friend or relative. Over 50% of ACs were financed in installments. Now, why people purchase ACs? We find that 94% of the households said that they purchased an AC because of the cooling need or the ineffectiveness of existing cooling appliances. Less than 10% of the households purchased an AC for the augmented economic status. Most households which did not have an AC in our sample mentioned the high costs of purchase of an AC and then the high recurring costs like electricity bills, maintenance and repair as the key reasons of not having purchased an AC as yet. The next couple of slides look into the decision making regarding an efficient star-rated air conditioner. In our sample, 37% of the households own a 3-star AC, 10% own a 4-star AC, and 24% of the households own a 5-star AC. 8% of the households did not own a star-rated AC. When we looked into the reasons why households opted for a lower star rating or did not go for a higher star rating, the figure on the left shows the reasons that the households reported. The sample here is households which use a 3-star or a lesser star rating AC. And we find that 64% of the households reported that the higher cost of a more efficient air conditioner was the reason they did not buy a more efficient technology. 24% of the households said that more efficient options were not available and hence they bought a 3-star or a lesser rated AC. The retailer influenced about 7% of the households in the decision they made on the star rating of the AC. The figure on the right shows the reasons why households opted for a higher rating of the AC. So the sample here is people who bought a 4-star or a 5-star AC. And savings on energy and savings on electricity bill were reported to be the key reasons of buying a higher efficiency rated AC. Environmental friendliness of a higher star rated AC was also a key reason why people went for the more efficient AC. Using regression analysis, we examined the characteristics of the households and the key factors that influence the purchase of a more efficient air conditioner. This table gives the regression results. It shows the main statistically significant factors associated with the rating of the most used AC in the household. And we find that people who are more likely to buy a higher efficient AC also tend to be more aware about energy schemes, the government's energy efficiency schemes and programs, specifically the STAR labeling program. They know, they've seen labels on their appliances, they know what it means, and the overall awareness was higher about these programs. An interesting thing is that people who have higher star-rated ACs also tend to own other efficient appliances, for example, the star-rated fans. We also find that households that have more senior citizens tend to have a lower efficiency AC, probably indicating lower levels of awareness amongst other factors.
Sorry to interrupt. So we're over 15 minutes. So if you can just go through the rest of the slides a little quickly. Thanks.
Sure, Radhika. Yes. Okay. We find that split ACs tend to be more efficient than window ACs. Also, older and second-hand ACs were likely to have a lower efficiency rating, and costlier ACs tend to have a higher star rating. When looking at how structural characteristics influence efficiency decisions, we find that homes that have more rooms, possibly indicating a larger floor area, and that own a power backup that they use with the AC, tend to own a more efficient air conditioner. Now, looking at the role the women play in cooling-related decision-making, we find that while an AC benefits all members of the household, the decision making around the AC purchase and use and the technical knowledge about the cooling appliances and the AC is highly skewed towards men. So as I already said, that men tend to be the male head of the household, tends to be the key decision maker regarding purchase of cooling appliances. We also found that women are more likely to not have a preference on which AC to buy. Women were less familiar with the type of AC they own. They had lesser knowledge about the brand, capacity, star rating, and the warranty of the AC they had in the house. And they had lower levels of awareness about the energy efficiency schemes. So I'll just talk about some key takeaways from our work and policy recommendations and wrap up with that. So based on our survey findings, we find that these purchase of the more energy intensive cooling appliances, namely coolers and ACs, is relatively recent. And even amongst these wealthier neighborhoods where we sample from, 18% of the households still only own a fan. The fans and coolers tend to be inefficient, and the average rating of an AC is 3-star. These all point to a unique opportunity to tap the first-time buyers of air conditioners and the urgent need for interventions to rapidly scale up the adoption of more energy-efficient cooling appliances. Some suggestions on interventions based on what we find from our work. Awareness about energy efficiency schemes can really drive up the adoption of more efficient appliances, as we see from our results. The retailer or the vendor, which is the most common point of purchase, can also play a key role in influencing a more energy efficient choice of appliance. We find that a significant number of ACs are financed through installments. So innovative financing mechanisms can help promote the purchase of more efficient appliances. Finally, I think we need to better understand the role of women in cooling related decisions and help promote their increased informed participation, which can help drive up the adoption of energy efficient appliances. I think that's it.
Thanks, Anna. Great. So we have about 5 minutes for questions and a number of questions. I'll read some of them out. So let's begin with this one, which asks that the AC rent market is expected to be quite high in Delhi, but this doesn't show up so much in the sample. And if you can comment on that.
Yes. And Radhika also, you're involved in this work, so feel free to take some of these questions. Yes, rental market is picking up, and we did try to capture that through a survey. We did not find enough households with rental ACs in our sample to say something meaningful about them. Very less.
Right. Right. Okay. Next question is that was there anything specific about the 18% households who had high income but didn't have fans?
I think so. What I think there our understanding till now is just that even sort of when you control for things like temperature and income, there is just heterogeneity in cooling consumption. We need to investigate a little bit more about what possible factors might be driving the difference. But it generally points to maybe people's preferences. We did find some households that preferred not having an AC and preferred the more traditional fans and coolers cooling approach.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think actually it's there. 18% is not the number of households, the percentage of households that don't have fans. That 18% is something else. Almost everybody has a fan.
Oh,
so I think that was an. So I think the person who asked this just read the graph incorrectly.
Sorry,
so
I think I did not hear it. Hear the question right. 18% are the households that own a fan. They do not own a cooler or an AC. Almost over 99% of the sample has a fan.
Right. Okay, so there are a couple of questions then regarding the set point and whether there was a question about set point temperatures, which there was, and what is the set point temperature that most people want to, want to use. So what is the common temperature setting? So I think that's not in the slides, but maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah. So it's not in the slides, but on an average, we find set point to be around 24 degrees Celsius. It varies quite a bit amongst households, from people preferring below 18 degrees to people preferring over 26 degrees Celsius. But around 24 degrees is an average set point temperature preferred by households.
Great. Okay. Then there's a question that says, was there any question asked to understand the size or the tonnage decision of the AC and any correlation between that tonnage of the AC purchased and the household size to see if that decision on tonnage was based on requirement?
So I don't remember the penetration of 1.5 tons from top of my head, but I think it's a very skewed sample. Most AC owning households had a 1.5 ton. So with the sample being so skewed, it's very hard to say that people who had 0.75 tons or 2 tons, how do they differ from the ones who had 1.5 tons?
Right. Okay. Then there's a question that says, did your work on cooling demand look at frequency of use? If so, is the frequency of use increasing? Does the efficiency of appliances influence the frequency and amount of use? So in other words, do households with more efficient appliances use them more often?
I think on usage, I think we find that on an average, the households use AC for about 4 to 5 hours a day. And Radhika, correct me, I think I don't have them on the slide, so it's I'm just trying to recollect that. The higher the households that tend to use AC more, one of the factors we found was that the households showed more dependence on using an AC. So they reported that there were certain activities they could not do without an AC. Whereas the households that tend to use AC less also tended to be more conscious about their electricity bills, about saving electricity while using AC. So it was more around consciousness of how much how much you're trying to save electricity and how much are you dependent on AC for your cooling need, which really sort of influenced how long people used ACs. I don't remember seeing seeing a correlation between people who have more efficient ACs using it less or more.
Great, thanks, Anna. So we're out of time. There are some other questions which we've not been able to get to, but we will save a log of these and try and respond. There are a couple of logistical ones where people are asking, will these presentations be made available? The answer to that is that it depends on the presenter. So if they want to make their presentation available, please write to them and they will share it with you if they are comfortable with that. And there's also someone asking about the publishing of this work. So this is, it's a paper in progress at this point, going to be submitted, any day now. So we will have that, we'll have that ready whenever the peer review process lets us have it ready. All right, so with that, thanks Anna so much. I am going to turn it over to Amita, who is going to talk about cooling consumption, again in Delhi, but using very different methods. So Amita, you have 15 minutes. Try and see me come on when it's 13 minutes, and if not, I'll interrupt.
Great. Thank you so much, Radhika. Thanks for inviting me here. Now, unlike the research that you and Anna and others have done, my research is at a much more preliminary stage. Radhika, please say yes if you can see my screen.
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Okay. So I'm part of a project with the National University of Singapore, and collaborators elsewhere on heat in urban Asia. And we're looking at Singapore, Wuhan in China, and Delhi in India. And by we, I mean a group of anthropologists, historians, geographers, and climate scientists. And within the three topics you see here, taking the city's temperature, living with heat, and disastrous heat, my focus is on living with heat and looking at how different social groups in Delhi have coped with heat over time in terms of daily rhythms, building technologies, land use patterns, and so on, designed to adapt to the specifically extreme temperatures and dry air of Delhi. So within this kind of chronological mapping, air conditioning, of course, is a prominent watershed in terms of people's experience of heat. And I must say that my research is at a very preliminary stage because I was supposed to do fieldwork over the summer, but with the lockdown, it didn't happen. So what I'm sharing with you are some early thoughts and directions of work, which have emerged in conversation with my colleagues who are a part of this project. And when I do get to do field work, it's mainly going to take the form of in-depth interviews and participant observation in homes and in workplaces with a sample of Delhi's population that is stratified by class, gender, age, and occupation. So, very briefly, let me tell you what I consider the main backdrop for the kinds of changes we're looking at. The first, of course, is climate change, which globally has been experienced in the form of increasing frequency and intensity of what are called extreme events. In the case of India, these are heat waves and cold waves and changes in precipitation. However, in the case of Delhi, as Krishna Achutharao and others argued last year, examining the data, they're all climate scientists, they said it's not clear whether a climate-related trend can be seen in Delhi, and partly because it's, heating has been offset by, paradoxically enough, the rise in air pollution in the city. However, they do show that in Delhi, there's been a rise in nighttime temperatures and a rise in humidity. So both of these changes, nights being much warmer and Delhi being more humid, both of them have big implications for comfort, whether you sleep well at night, whether you feel sticky and sluggish, means that your technological decisions change. So, fairly low cost, low energy using things like the desert cooler, which generations of people have used in Delhi, are now less attractive seeming because you can only use them in those days when when it is hot and dry. But these long periods when you have increased humidity make desert coolers that much less comfortable in Delhi. Uh, After climate change, or along with climate change, the next big the transformation is, of course, economic liberalization since the 1990s, where India has witnessed rising incomes, but also rising inequalities, increased aspirations for an improved quality of life, which people measure, among other things, by their ownership of consumer durables. And for the middle classes, the cost of appliances and private vehicles has actually fallen relative to their income. And for the lower middle classes, the availability of consumer loans makes it possible to invest in what would otherwise have been, big ticket items that they wouldn't have been able to find the lump sums for at one go. Along with climate change and liberalization, the other big transformation that a number of people mentioned is the change in the infrastructure of electricity. That in Delhi, power is available much more reliably the interruptions, the outages and breakages are far less than used to be the case earlier. And of course, this availability of uninterrupted power is absolutely crucial for the spread of all refrigeration technologies, whether domestic or commercial, ignoring for the moment private cars. But only when you have constant bijli can you change how you build homes and offices and public spaces like malls and colleges and hospitals and metro stations. So, for almost a century in arid climates in India, fans and coolers were the chief technologies for dealing with heat. And this was, before air conditioning came along. However, if technologies were limited, there were plenty of techniques that adapted life to climate and place. And these techniques varied according to social location and means. But let me just make some general observations. One, when we think about heat, we can't think about heat as if it's, heat alone. We have to consider heat in relation to humidity, in relation to dust, in relation to whether air is moving, whether there's a breeze, smells. All of these come together and shape the experience of heat. And there are a series of bodily practices that people in Delhi have, engaged in over generations to deal with heat. The first of these is, of course, diurnal rhythms. What do you do at different times of day? So you start the day early, you avoid working or going out in the hottest hours of the afternoon. Um, Clothing, there are seasonal changes in terms of fabric and color. You use umbrellas, and if you can afford it, sunglasses. But for even those who can't afford, seasonal clothing and so on, certain articles of clothing, like the multi-purpose gamcha, um, are uh, are wielded in ways so that you avoid body temperatures rising. You cover your head, wipe off sweat, you moisten it, and you stay cool. So everybody, regardless of class, makes some adjustment to the heat by how they wear clothes. Water, drinking a lot of water, bathing as often as possible, sprinkling water on bedclothes, all time-honored strategies for dealing with extreme heat. Most important, of course, though, is food. And most Indians follow, either consciously or unconsciously, some elements of an Ayurvedic or Unani system of health, which fuses together ideas of nutrition and medicine, treating the whole mind and body. So the idea of cooling and heating foods and beverages is really important for the way in which people deal with seasonal variations. That's to do with all of this is a set of bodily practices that my research aims to explore in greater detail and look at it in relation to class, age, gender, occupation. Now, in addition to this, there are, of course, a lot depends on how the architecture of cities has been adapted to dealing with heat. And in older, wealthier neighborhoods, you can still see in houses that were built before the 1990s, you can see deep verandas to block the direct sun, thicker walls, the use of door top ventilators in order to allow breeze to come in and out, the use of fabric in curtains and in chicks, the use of building materials that absorb less heat, making porches and outdoor seating areas in order to enjoy the cooler air outside. This indoor-outdoor division is actually a major part of the spatial strategies of people across classes. In working class bastis, where houses tend to be small and there's ventilation is poor, people make use of outdoor spaces. And if there's a park where you can get some shade or breeze, or people use their own doorsteps in some cases. I don't have a good picture, but I put out one that I could find in my collection. People sleep out And even in working class areas, what you see is an extensive use of the terrace, the chat, as a place of hanging out, of sleeping outdoors at night, of some attempt to escape the heat in the evenings and early mornings. Of course, these strategies are greatly divided and differentiated by what class you belong to. But it's clear that just as in rural areas where it's the poorer people who own fewer private resources, who depend on the commons and on public areas, so also in the city, in working class neighborhoods, among poorer people, public spaces matter much more in terms of areas where people can deal with the heat. Now, of course, for the wealthy, you don't need to deal with the heat if you can escape in the summer months to a hill station. That also is a spatial strategy for dealing with extreme temperatures. The defining feature of most of these strategies is that they are flexible, they're low cost, low energy, and they have a smaller ecological footprint. And these strategies are still in use, but less so, partly because urban spaces are now much more densely built. Building materials now absorb more heat, and architecture has changed, especially office architecture, public spaces like hospitals and colleges, etc., in response to the availability of air conditioners. And partly there's a vicious cycle at work here because since the exhaust heat from air conditioning raises temperatures throughout, adding to the urban heat island effect, therefore more people turn towards air conditioning. So this, of course, is in addition to all the reasons I outlined earlier about higher temperatures, more disposable incomes, more loans available to people. Now, perhaps the most important thing that air conditioning has done for urban residents, except the poorest, is that it has reset their personal thermostats. So, air conditioning is a little bit like the internet in the sense that once you have used it, you can't imagine life without it. And when you don't have it, you actively and acutely feel the absence of air conditioning as a lack, something that's missing in your life. So, temperatures that could be tolerated earlier now feel deeply uncomfortable. So that since air conditioning is addictive, that one quickly gets accustomed to it and it forever recalibrates one's idea of thermal comfort. Of course, this is not the case uniformly, and it also depends a lot on the extent to which one comes into air-conditioned spaces. So, for someone who is, say, a street vendor who almost never ventures into an air-conditioned space, it might be going to a government office or traveling by the metro to the wholesale market. That might lead them to experience air conditioning for at least some part of as part of their life. So the extent to which you live your life in air conditioned spaces makes a difference. Um, but the social experience of heat is also extremely stratified. I won't talk about class and income and occupation because this is something that we do need to look at much more closely. But let me just end by making a few preliminary remarks. And one of them is that turned out to be more important than we had expected is that of age and the generational shift that air conditioning represents. Because those Delhi residents who grew up without it and who are still affluent enough to afford it regard air conditioning still as a luxury and they limit their use because for this generation virtue is still associated with self-denial. They worry that prolonged exposure to air conditioning makes you sick and that it makes you less resilient and able to cope with adverse conditions. So their idea of health includes a strong component of the idea of self-discipline and denial. And they feel that air conditioning kind of just makes you, much more dhila, much more, not as tough as their age used to be, not able to endure hardship. Now, for the younger generation, especially the middle classes and the more affluent ones who've grown up with it, air conditioning is a necessity. And it's something to seek out if you don't have it at home. So, which restaurant you go to, coffee shops and malls rather than, say, street markets. Most important, young white collar professionals, even people who are Uber drivers or and so on, they regard air conditioning as necessary for being productive and for being social, relaxing with friends. So increasingly, youthful sociality happens indoors and not outdoors. Um, Incidentally, Singapore's state policy of encouraging air conditioning is also explicitly driven by the idea of creating productive citizens. So, temperature control in order to maximize productivity. So, thinking about the person as an economic animal. Um, I'll end with the idea that I mentioned earlier, the vicious cycle. More ACs create more heat for everyone else, greater inequality, new ideas of well being, deprivation, and aspiration, and what has been called the cooling gap. And I recently read this report called Chilling Prospects, Sustainable Cooling for All, which sort of takes it as which assumes in a way that that you do need more air conditioning, and it actually goes seamlessly from the idea of maintaining a cold chain for vaccines to saying, well, we need it for food safety and refrigeration for for food security. Then it goes on to then sort of fold within all that the idea of the air conditioner as something that you need to have all the time because it cools and this is the way in which everybody should be. So hidden within this are of course all sorts of assumptions about urban design and how and building technologies, about income inequalities and so on. So I think before we jump to the idea that our focus should really be on making air conditioners more efficient, um, we need to, and that should be the primary goal of policy interventions. We need to re-look at the larger context within which people have experienced heat and dealt with it, because in the long run, there's a lot of intermediate technologies, there are a lot of simple behavioral practices that are important to retain and encourage. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amita. That was really useful. And we've been looking at social constructions of cooling as well. So it's nice to see the parallels in the work. So we have a bunch of questions here. Let me begin by one that asks about humidity, and the question is that it's hard to adapt to humidity, and are there strategies that people use to adapt to high humidity, or is it just a matter of higher tolerance?
Well, the humidity is in some ways, or rather the increase in the period when Delhi is humid, is a recent phenomenon. That's what the climate data for Delhi shows us. Um, I can't say more because I haven't, as I said, the study hasn't really actually started. But from conversations with my colleagues in Singapore, where humidity is year round, it's very clear that that buildings that had, say, more open air passages, staircases, balconies, and verandas, windows that allowed breeze in, and the alignment of buildings, to capture sea breezes and so on. All of these are ways in which humidity has been dealt with in the in more enduring architecture. Delhi hasn't ever had the need to deal with humidity. In fact, in Delhi, the fact that you use coolers meant that you wanted to create humidity, not take it away. So I think this is a new phenomenon, and one can see, therefore, the attraction of air conditioning because it does dehumidify as well.
Right. Thanks. So, okay, here there's a question which is related to laws and planning laws, and it's a large question. So I'm going to summarize it. But the crux of it is that, what is the impact of the kinds of things that you have observed in laws and getting those to be embedded within town planning laws in Delhi and otherwise. So sort of things like having mandatory four-way ventilation or having two sides that are exposed, how has this influenced not just architecture, but also practice and rules around urban planning?
I think it's a huge mess. I mean, I can only quote the work of a fellow anthropologist, Anne Rademacher. I'll write her name down in chat so that and the thing about, wait, it doesn't let me, all panelists and attendees. Here we go. Yeah. So the thing is that even if one looks at building codes and their idea of energy efficiency, most of these are for buildings which have built-in air conditioning. So, as that means that the very idea that a building need not be air conditioned is in some ways foreign to the ways in which global architecture recognizes energy efficiency. And the same holds true for India as well. And Anne Rademacher's work is on building codes in Mumbai. The largest scenario as far as A, having the right kinds of laws and regulations, and B, their implementation is an absolute fiasco. And if I get started on this, I'll never stop. But I'll just mention that I discuss the sort of fatal flaws within our planning process in my book that came out in January. It's called Unequal City: Ecology, Equity, and the Commons in Delhi, where I talk about the way in which planning instruments like the master plan have consistently operated in ways which actually make life much harder for poorer citizens and end up seriously with seriously adverse effects on the environment.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, can you say a little bit more about aspirations of owning an AC among low-income households? Do you see this as a possibility of reduction and revival of older traditional techniques of cooling?
Well, I think for poorer households, and especially if I think of specifically the working class bastis where I have done my research, people right now can't go beyond having a cooler. Most of them live in areas where these are often squatter settlements or unauthorized colonies, where actually the power infrastructure isn't sturdy enough for them to be able to draw the kind of power that you need for ACs anyway. But even if that were not the case, most of them just couldn't afford it. Even if they were to, take a loan, an AC would be still be out of their reach. So people make do with the cooler, with ceiling fans. They come out of the house, sit on the otla, the raised platform outside the house, with many people still use the old woven fans that you use with your hand, and so on. So there will be a while before the poorest people uh, could afford ACs, if at all. But I think that for the low middle class, it is something that they increasingly, desire. But because they can't afford it, the idea is, well, you try and maximize the time you spend in places which are air conditioned. So instead of, for instance, a courting couple, instead of, say, going into a park, would now go into a mall or into the metro station and find a quiet corner because for some privacy, because it's air conditioned. It feels more comfortable than being in some sweaty, sunny place.
Right, absolutely. Okay, there are a couple of questions on method, so I'll take them together. One is that how will you study and compare the three different cities that you mentioned? Another is that the idea of public provision of cooth rather than the supply of AC in a home is quite interesting. And how do you intend to explore these behaviors? And then sort of similar on method is, are you trying to look at how people are coping with higher temperatures in a systematic manner, and therefore trying to influence thermal comfort standards?
Okay. Uh, so to the first question, I'm not studying all three cities. I couldn't do fieldwork in China or Singapore. China especially, I don't speak the language. No, so we're a group of researchers, and my research is based in Delhi. And there's Chris Courtney from Durham University who's working on Wuhan in China, and he's an environmental historian of China. And there's Jathui, who is an architect, architectural historian who's working on Singapore and so on. So there's a team of us, different disciplines, but primarily history, geography, sociology, who are looking at these in different cities. And to a certain extent, we're using similar methodologies. So the questions that I use are based on the questions that Chris started off with in Wuhan, and similar questions will be asked in Singapore as well. So the idea is to create some sort of a common, oral history archive around this issue. But we will also be, I haven't ever done sort of serious historical work, but for this, I plan to look at, the visual media, advertisements, the ways in which people have heat and heat-related appliances have been advertised in the past, and how articles about people dealing with heat. The second question about public versus private cooling is I think I don't really know how to answer it because I haven't looked at it in close, in closely enough. But I know from the literature that a very important element of dealing with heat waves is the availability of public spaces which are air conditioned. And there've been really excellent historical studies of heat waves in Chicago, in New York City, in France, in Paris, and all of them show that it's that often in these cities it's been older people in their little apartments which are insulated against the cold, but which in fact have no ventilation, etc., who were most at risk because of heat waves. And the only way that, and later, when disaster management strategies around heat waves were put in place to try and identify those people who are most vulnerable, they then figured out that what you need to do is identify vulnerable people and then have plans to take them to the nearest public library or to the nearest metro station, the nearest swimming pool, public swimming pool, that is. So there's a way in which public, in the case of extreme events, heat waves, public facilities can be used strategically. And this is important, especially because in those heat waves that I talked about, what often happened was that since everybody in an area who had an AC was using it to deal with the extreme heat, there were neighborhoods where there were power blackouts because the power they were drawing was too much. So again, therefore, one needs to discourage too much private consumption of electricity because that then ends up being a problem for everyone as a whole. The third question was, I've forgotten. If Radhika, you can remind me.
Yeah, it was about whether you're looking at this in a systematic manner, in a way to inform thermal standards.
I don't know how my study can inform thermal standards because I actually don't work in that kind of, directly policy-oriented way. The idea is just to try and, understand the phenomenon, how it's changed, what's driving it, how do people relate to it, and if there are lessons in there for practitioners and policy analysts and so on, that's great. But I don't even have I haven't even done the research, let alone have findings where I can say I can flag something and say, I think this is important from the policy point of view, but it's certainly not something which is there as a conscious intent in my research.
Right, but I think that sociological, sort of piece and analysis is so important and so missing. So it's really wonderful that you're embarking on it. We do have a lot of other questions, but we are also out of time. So I'm going to ask everybody to sit tight, because after Ronita's presentation, we have about half an hour for all panelists, for questions for all panelists. So we'll come back to Amita's questions at that time. Okay, thank you, Amita. We are now going to have Ronita present her work on cooling and low-income households. So Ronita, in about, you have 15 minutes, and in 13, I'll put my video on. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll just let me know if you can hear me, and I'll start sharing my screen. So let me know if you can see it. Is it visible and audible?
Yes.
Excellent.
Might want to put it on presentation
Yes.
mode.
Yeah.
Great. Perfect.
So thank you for putting me in the last, because it gives a lot of context to what I will be speaking on currently. So I will talk about, so I titled my talk as Not So Cool, and you will know why I'm talking about this as I move on. So I'll give a very brief what I basically work on. I basically work, I am the director of the Sustainable Design Group at University of Cambridge, and I work on the 4 verticals of SDG, of gender, energy, sustainable communities, and health and well-being. So this is a nexus of diagram, which you can go and see it in my webpage. So today's talk would be basically built on 2 basic researches which I had conducted, and I have chosen these 2 because these represent 2 different spectrum of the society. So one is future cities, that India is currently calling for 100 smart cities, future cities, to be built cities, and how does cooling demand look there, and what is exactly cooling means in low income habitat, which is the other spectrum of the socioeconomic data that we all are talking about. And Amita has really given a very good context to the work that I will be speaking on. So first I will deal with what will happen to our future. So I'll talk about future cities, and here I just give you a very brief that India has been facing a lot of heat waves from, if you, a study from 2005 to 2015 has said that the largest heat wave affected area is Andhra Pradesh, and the cooling demand is definitely rising exponentially over the years. And this is a very lumped figure for whole of India. And so I decided, if it's Andhra Pradesh, the first smart city is also to be staged in Andhra Pradesh. And let's start looking at what happens if that city comes into being in next 30 years. So it's the case study is Amravati, the capital city of which will be converted to a smart city. And Amravati is approximately a 217 square kilometer, covering estimated population of 4.5 million. This is just the capital city I'm talking about, and will be estimated of up to 2050, and that it will currently be the first city, and it has also pledged that it will reduce 3 degrees in terms of climate change, and also increase energy efficiency or reduce the energy demand, especially from cooling, by 30%. And that's a huge figure to kind of commit, although the deadline is 2050. So I'll just give a context what happens when we kind of look at the current status. So in 2018, when the city was just has started to build, almost nothing has been built. You can only see a few roads. The temperature differences, this is just the land surface temperature. This will be augmented by the air surface temperature. So a little bit like 6 to 7 degrees higher at certain points. And at this point, probably you can see high ranges around 36 to 24 to 36. And if you see that the very next year, when the city has almost started to build, not the whole, buildings have not yet come up, you will see a rise of 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. And that's the concern, is not only just building the city, but when the city starts getting populated, the population will demand a large amount of heat. And this is, so what we did was we took a small neighborhood of around 2,000 households, and all these houses, let me remind you, are not yet built. These are all in their vision plan. So what we did was we generated a computer simulated city or a neighborhood, which comprised of two typologies of houses. One was detached, other was apartment type. The apartment types had like 4 different classes with different sort of classifications in their built environment. And you can have the figures there. So we said that in order to, because Andhra Pradesh has been hit as the highest heat waves in the past 10 years, it is likely to continue. And Guntur and Vijayawada, which basically is links this Amravati city, it's centrally located to these two cities, they have also registered a very high heat waves over the years. So their cooling demands have definitely gone up. I don't have the figure as of now, but we wanted to see if there is a mitigation framework that can be built only because of the climate change induced heat stress that is there. So what we did was from the computer generated city, we estimated what should be the energy demand over the months, and what would be the energy demand, and what sort of energy demand would look like. So on your left hand side, you see the annual energy demand of the two different typologies, whereas on your right hand side, you see it on various months, how the houses are behaving in terms of their energy demand. So some houses have very low energy demand, and very few houses you will find energy demand going up more than 3 kilowatt hour per meter square. So we started looking at the variability in terms of typology, and definitely the apartment typology was consuming much more. The detached typology was consuming much more than the apartment typology. And that led us to think that probably there is some relation to policy variables that we can link. And we found out mainly when the outdoor temperature is 22 to 27, the energy demand for both the typologies increased by 8% for the detached and 3% for the apartment type. And with higher FSI, which is the flow space index, which is basically the total amount of built up area which you are allowed to build based on the vision plan document, the demand was actually exponentially rising. So we said, in order to take a mitigation measure, because there is also in the document, they say that they are going to make Amravati a very solar intensive city, at almost like nearly 25% of energy demand can be met by that. So we estimated the solar energy that can be produced. And we found out that there is also a rule that any houses which is above 1,000 meters square have to participate in this solar energy program. So there's huge potential to actually harvest the solar energy and kind of mitigate the heat and energy demand that will be generated in the city. So we generated a decision tree and wanted to understand P2P sharing between NEST and EST. So what is NEST, which is non-energy stressed buildings, versus EST's energy stress building. So we found out approximately for May around 13% buildings could be covered. May is the hottest month, and it could be covered by the P2P. And almost after optimization, almost 80% buildings can be made non-energy stressed. So if I do a network diagram, so it's a very simple diagram where the building which generates the maximum amount of energy first shares it to the the nearest energy stressed building, and then so on after fulfillment of its own energy needs. And this goes on until the energy is completely optimized within that network. So we can see in May, we can almost kind of meet 25 to 30% of energy demand, whereas in November, we don't need so much because of the temperature, outside temperature, and the cooling demand also comes down. And there also almost 10% to 20% can be covered by this network. So if I have to now set down certain rules so that our buildings become automatically non-energy stressed from the very beginning. So these are some of the rules of, especially for the case of the Smart City Amravati, where they have actually categorized what should be the minimum plot size, what should be the built-up coverage area. So we can have a kind of a lookup table, and then we can actually decide what sort of energy stress we would be looking for in the future. So this gives a very brief idea that even for cities which we are calling smart cities with all kind of technology in place, there might be a challenge in meeting some of the energy demands, but that can be met through a different sort of a technological and a network sort of an approach. I'll come to the other spectrum of my work, where we talk about what does cooling actually means for low-income housing, and I'll talk about two papers here. I'm not talking in depth about the methods. Anybody who is interested in details can definitely go in. These papers are all online. So I'll talk about a classic case of Mumbai, and because I chose Mumbai because of a lot of reasons. For my spatial proximity at that point in time when I was doing the research, it houses the largest, one of the largest, Asia's largest slum, which also produces the largest GDP. Contributes a very high amount of GDP to the to Maharashtra's total gross domestic product, and overnight it is also a kind of a adobe for almost 50% population living in Mumbai. So it's around, the figure is a little varying between 50 to 55%. Very safely said that 50% of population actually lives in slums or slum-like situations in Mumbai. So in order to kind of counter that, slums are definitely an urban apathy, and it has to be removed, and does create removal of slums does have a lot of history behind it. I'm not talking about that, but they are now being replaced by something which is called vertical towers. So what it is doing basically, it is these houses or the vertical towers would look like this. And definitely what they does is they replaces the slum dwellers and give these houses for free. So these are 25 square meter to 30 square meter of tenement unit, a single multi-purpose room with a toilet attached. And the slum dwellers who will not have to move from their place, these are built in situ. That means where these dwellers are residing, the building would be built there, and the rest of the plot would be used for meeting other amount of housing deficit that is there. So this has, for the first time in India's housing policy history, has yielded about 2% of economic growth, and also has closed the housing deficit to a significant amount. And this is now also currently a part of the Housing for All plan, which the government of India is about to close around 2022, which is almost near. So win-win situation. The slum dweller with a wait time of 5 years can get a house which is tenement unit. So he or she owns the tenancy. Typically, the tenancy or the tenureship is on the name of the lady of the household, or the oldest person, or the woman of the household. And the secure tenure is about 99 years, and there are also some variations there. But it's almost like owning an apartment in Mumbai. Who wouldn't want to have it? So here we wanted to ask that what does actually fuel poverty or thermal comfort or cooling actually looks like in these sort of settlements? Because overnight they are being, well, not overnight in literal senses, but they are being transferred from slums, which are tenured units, and getting actually an apartment in Mumbai. So it's a complete change in the built environment, and possibly will bring about differences in their perceptions to cooling, differences in the perceptions to thermal comfort, or may not also bring. So I'll talk about that. So if you see Mumbai's climate, it's typically on an average you will find around 27, 28 degrees almost throughout the year. Summer months can be can go higher up. And here the summer months are, you'll see just right after the monsoons, the temperatures rises a bit more. And we kind of did a survey of more than 1,200 households in these sort of houses. And we got their energy bills, and we found out that it's almost around 100 kilowatt hour, and which is lower than the national average. So definitely they are not using as much energy. And how much energy can you use in a 30 square meter of built environment? So we went there and wanted to understand what is their perception of cooling, or what is their perception of feeling warm. And we asked them, so if you see in the thermal sensation scale where these two intersect, you will find that they intersect at a point which is beyond the neutral. So that means they prefer to cool down, and they prefer more cooler environments. So we started looking at, sorry. We started looking at their appliance ownership, and we found out that obviously, like Anna said, that almost 99% of the population owns a fan, and that's probably the first cooling device that they use, although we know from it's not exactly a cooling energy device. Whereas there are other sorts of, so you'll see almost plethora of appliances, which you will also see in a middle income household. Microwaves do appear, but a very less percentage. Room heaters are almost non-existent. Obviously, you don't need in that kind of temperature. Uh, Television, cook stove, refrigerator is almost there, over 60% of the households. And that means the most of the energy that that they are consuming, which we saw in the previous slide, comes from refrigerator, lighting, and also fans probably. But we do see incidences of air conditioner coming up recently. So this survey was conducted in 2018. In 2019, when we revisited the site, the amount of air conditioners has increased almost 25%. But do they really use it? Our later data shows not really. So we said that, so if they do not have any other kind of active cooling, so what do they do to mitigate their heat stress? Because most of them preferred a cooler environment. Most of them would choose windows and doors and ceiling fan. And so windows and doors is almost like naturally ventilated spaces. So there is an opportunity still lies that if these houses are designed in a particular or a perfect fashion in order to enable natural ventilation, probably they would not shift to the cooling, or the AC aspiration is still not there. Air conditioner is still not in that aspirational buy that they have. We also tried to understand and corroborate our data from on various seasons across 2 different locations of similar typology of housing the same socioeconomic status, and we didn't find much of a difference with minor variations. We found that outdoor temperature does kind of allow people to open their windows up to a certain degree, and after that they close their windows. So it's a U curve, inverted U curve, whereas they do keep their doors open. However, we did find that door opening was more of a privacy issue. Window was privacy, as well as there were other issues of dust. There were other issues of their perception that the opening of window might make them feel cooler. The
Nina,
use of
sorry to
ceiling.
interrupt.
Yes.
We're out of time, so if you could just go through the other slides a little quickly.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. So the proportion of fans were also very similar. So as the temperature rose, it was linearly increasing. So we did find that with increase of availability of controls, that is the number of controls that they had in order to control their thermal comfort or their cooling demand, they were more forgiving towards the environment. That means as the mean comfort operative temperature increased, they indicated forgiving attitude towards the environment. So we wanted to understand what sort of cooling strategies these people use and what that can lead to. So we had a set of strategies, or 5 set of strategies, and that led to if we say window as the base case, there are strategies like door opening, window curtains, ceiling fan, PLS planters. These are all non-energy intensive strategies for cooling. So we wanted to understand the degree of effectiveness of each of these strategies. And then we found out that is there a strategy that can be adopted? So we said took 2 scenarios. So in a normal base case scenario, we found out, except for opening of windows, which is S1, and doors, there was no other strategy that was actually being is acceptable to this sort of a community. So the red line has to cross the blue line in order to the strategy for the strategy to be acceptable. So we chose 2 scenarios, scenario 1, sorry, and scenario 2, where community interventions were done, where 50%, like providing free planters or providing some 50% contribution from the community that comes from, so they form a community and do these sort of interventions. And from another scenario where policy interventions are done, that they are given subsidized materials like reflective rooftop tiles or reflective coating of coloring in their buildings, or also renewables. So we did find that on an after optimization process, there were 4 strategies that could be, I'm skipping this slide, you can also have a look at it. There were like 4 strategies in an order of their decreasing cost. So you can use like double glaze emissivity, which is also an acceptable strategy in this sort of an. So all these strategies which I just now discussed are strategies which are acceptable to this community, and they are going to adopt it. So it is an implementable solution. S4 is like reflective tiles and reflective paints, which generally comes from subsidies or which comes from policy interventions. Last two strategies are use of planters and exhaust fans, and use of curtains and ceiling fans, along with door and window opening and closing behavior. These two strategies can be done at the community level, and are also acceptable. So I end my talk here, but if you have any questions, please let me know.
Great. Thanks so much, Ranita. So we have a bunch of questions, and let's take those for about up to 5:30. So, and then I'll open it up to the last half an hour for everyone, and ask all the other panelists to join. But right now, let's focus on your presentation. So the first question is, in your opinion, what on thermal comfort in slums versus in the SRA settlements, which one is better?
So we didn't. I didn't include that study here, but we did a separate study on that also, where we inquired between the slums versus the SRA. Surprisingly, both of them gave us similar results. So they were not feeling comfortable both in the slums as well as in the SRA. So slums we can understand because that's an informal settlement, but SRAs are built for a better, so they call it rehabilitation housing. So our whole intention was to see whether they are thermally comfortable. And the answer is blank no, they are not thermally comfortable. But they do use a lot of techniques to combat their heat stress, and most of the stress on taking the heat, combating this energy crisis versus using cooling devices are taken by the women, which actually reflects what Amita said, and also Anna said in their previous presentations.
Yeah, great. Okay, then there's a methods question, kind of methods. So the question is curious about the concave nature of the window opening curves with heat and humidity. Why aren't the curves more linear instead, and what is causing the dip in the middle?
Yeah, so typically we could have also taken a linear. So we have tested the linear model also. In the relative humidity, we could have taken a linear one, but we wanted to specifically keep it like hyperbolic, because we wanted to show that with increase of temperature, there was a tendency to close the windows, which is very sensitive, because if you increase more, probably they will close the windows more, or may open it at some point, but we didn't find that kind of behavior there. So essentially we did take the linear as well as the hyperbolic curves to see which fitted better also. So the fit was much better for the hyperbolic curve, but linear is also acceptable in this case.
Great. All right. Then there's some questions about slum rehabilitation. There are three, and I'll ask them together. Where do slum dwellers live when the building is being constructed? How is their consent for this process taken? And how is their energy demand or bills likely to change with relocation to tower housing, especially those who live on floors 3 and above?
So the first question is how this whole process starts. So this whole process is a excellent participatory approach process. So these slum dwellers, they form a kind of a cooperative. They go to a builder and say, would you redevelop our slums? The builder, this is a very linear process, and it's a very good process, I would say, where the developer then says, yes, I'm going to build your slum, and then they put up a proposal in front of the Slum Rehabilitation Authority, which is the government body or the policy making body approving the slum rehabilitation program. During this phase, the developer builds a transit accommodation in situ. So while they are clearing the slums, that they had given a prefabricated house in the same place, in the same location. And typically a wait time of getting the completed house is around 5 years. Sometimes it also goes to 8 years, but on an average it's 5 years. So 5 years they live in these prefabricated almost similar looking apartments. So it's like an apartment tower building, which is a prefabricated house. They live there, and then later on they move there. The second question was basically where do they live, right? And I forgot. I'm sorry, I forgot the third question.
Yeah. Actually, the second question was about consent. The first one was where do they live when the building is being constructed, and then the third was what happens to their bills when they relocate.
Yes. So we did find a drastic increase in their energy bills, and I will tell you why. When they get a new house, it's almost like an aspirational buy. So what they do is they take loans to start populating their houses more with electrical appliances. This is just an aspirational buy, and it does stop after some time. We thought that, but it's not so. This whole vicious cycle of taking loans and purchasing appliances keep on going, and typically with uh, companies having guarantees and warranties period and EMIs for running for 3 years and for 5 years for even for a refrigerator or a very or a small air conditioner, they do take up these sort of EMI schemes up. So this is one, their energy bills have gone up. Secondly, in slums they spent most of the time outdoors. That is, they cooked, they spent whatever the time they needed to do inside, but they would come out because they had an association to the ground. Whereas when they moved to these slum rehabilitation colonies, their association to the or the spatial connect to the ground space was completely lost. So now most of their time they spend indoors, and by they I would mean the maximum population would be women and children. And so now we have also seen increase in the number of digital medias that they are consuming. So if there was only one television, you would find at least one television and probably three large screen mobile phones. Interestingly, women do not watch TV at all because they feel that the TV should be watched by the man, or because the man purchases the appliances. The man or the children, they watch their shows, whereas she watches her shows in the large mobile phone screen or something like that. They do all have air conditioners, which I said in the beginning. But when we ask them when do you use it, even for ceiling fan, they say because the onus of reducing the electricity bill is, although it's very subsidized, remains on the person who lives in the house for most of the time during the day. So she kind of controls, the woman kind of controls the usage of any kind of electrical devices. So we did find that there were large narratives which kind of said that they don't use, even if they are feeling they don't use ceiling fans, they don't use coolers, although we did see these sort of energy appliances in their houses. So it needs an in-depth study to understand whether the existence of an asset has any correlation to the behavior of the asset or usage of the asset.
Right. Great. Okay, I'm going to ask you your last question, but before I do that, I want to tell everybody who's watching that after that, we're going to go to questions for everyone. And while I have quite a few here, please feel free to retype them if I haven't asked them already. It'll be easier for me to get to them once we're done with this set of questions. And also, please ask new questions to any of the panelists after this. Okay, so Ronita, for you, there are a couple of questions that are similar on this. So they're asking that, as the units tend to be very cramped, what spatial variants of coping strategies did you notice and whether there were any surprises? And that also that SRA rehab buildings are designed with hardly any space between them, so they don't have any natural ventilation. And is there any choice but to go for fans, since most people can't afford air conditioners?
Yeah, so fans are. I would definitely talk about this, and I have written quite a lot about the design being flawed and how effective it can be. And we have seen that there are ways you can actually make the design more effective in terms of natural ventilation. And there is a classical case in Mumbai. So we studied three different SRA units, which are same typical 30 square meter units fitted together, but the design of the whole neighborhood was very different. So in one of the strategy, we found out that it enabled cross ventilation. Also, it had small open spaces at different levels. So this allowed them to recreate that connection to the ground. And so they did come out a lot because that's their habit, that's their behavior. I would say that's their cultural practice of coming out and gathering together. And so if that is restricted, then most of the time they would be restricted indoors. So one of these houses did promote very good natural ventilation, very good connect to the ground space at a very different levels of like at first floor level, and then there was at a third floor level. So these were very well designed slum rehabilitation housing with a very little compromise on the number of units that is built. So there has to be a compromise, because the bylaw says only the minimum recommendation. So if you give a builder the minimum recommendation, obviously you don't expect the person to go beyond that. So with the minimum recommendations in places, because the design was much more forgiving, so they had scope of natural ventilation.
Great. All right. So now I'm going to ask all the panelists to turn their video on, and let's get to questions for everybody. There's one general question, and any of you can choose to answer it, and hopefully all of you will, which is based on the three presentations, what policy changes are envisaged on the side of building design standards, cooling appliance efficiency, standards, monitoring and matching electricity supply with rising demand due to cooling? So policy implications of the work with regards to the built environment and cooling. And Amita, you don't have to answer. Anna, Ronita, Amita, any?
I think Anna can go first, and then I can take it up.
So on cooling appliance in specific, we looked at fans, coolers, and ACs, and we find very few star-rated fans. Most of the coolers are sort of locally assembled, inefficient coolers. So I think one thing is to sort of look at programs and policies to promote more higher efficient fans and coolers. And I think we saw in the other two presentations as well that a lot of sort of cooling services are still being provided by fans and coolers, whether it is in wealthy neighborhoods or in low-income populations, as the other presenters looked at. So I think that would be one. And I think so. What we also found was very varying levels of awareness about these programs amongst people. While there are people who know about these programs, there are fewer people who really understand what these programs mean. So we found that, say 70% of people know about the star rating program, but only a half of them would really have seen the labels, understand what they mean. And we find a very positive relationship between people who know about these programs, are aware, and that reflecting in the decisions they make about efficient appliances. So I think that would be the other recommendation, would be to really stress on awareness of these programs. So not just have them, but get the word out in driving adoption of more efficient appliances.
All right. If I thank you, Anna, and I do completely agree what you said. But if I have to actually answer this question, I personally feel that there is also two different ministries work together, or probably three different ministries. So if housing is not just considered as a product, but I'll talk about only residential here, but it's a process where multiple ministries do contribute in terms of environment, in terms of not just closing the housing deficit, even design bylaws. So there is definitely the Econivas bylaw that we do have, but it is still not a statutory kind of it is still a recommendatory sort of a guideline for most of, especially if I have to answer for the slum rehabilitation housing. Their sole goal is definitely to close the housing deficit and remove the slums and give them a better living environment. If this is tied up with these sort of programs, the cooling demand might be mitigated in a longer term. So I personally feel there's a huge opportunity here, because people have not yet, as Amita said in her talk, that it's still a luxury sort of a thing in most of the houses. And it's also about the thermal history, and if you have been living in a warmer environment, you'd probably tend to mitigate it through various other channels rather than resorting immediately to air conditioner, which did see. So air conditioners still in these sort of low income settlements are more of a luxury or a status item, which they do not use at all. So if I've asked them how many times they have used in the past 6 months, the answers were on an average maybe twice when my relatives came, or thrice for 15 minutes a day when it was very warm outside, just to cool down the room and then shut it off. So there is a huge gap in terms of even understanding what cooling means to a large section of the society. So it's not just completely giving them that preference of choosing the cooling demand and saying that go to a mall and you'll feel comfortable. There are also ways you can make comfortable outdoors without actually having ACs. So there are Japan has done it quite a lot in their open spaces. And I think at this point in time, when we are looking at an infectious disease, when you're looking at more of ventilation and outdoor spaces for most of our interactions, these sort of strategies should be included in the master plan itself, not just what should be the land use, but at a detail of urban design level. And I think instead of just promoting a certain rating system, I also feel there's a little less amount of nudges in the whole society about adopting these technologies. Just putting a label probably doesn't work in a country like India. You have to have much more other nudges involved. Maybe smart meter is a very good alternative to that, to showing what is your energy footprint at every day, which actually creates a huge amount of nudge. But that's a very high end I am looking at, not through the whole socioeconomic spectrum. I think Amita wants to.
Amita, yeah, you're muted.
Just one thing to add to what Anna and Ronita said, which is that I think I'm struck by how quickly we forget, because we have considerable expertise over the years of building in ways that are that adapt to climate rather than seek to impose total control over it. And within an alternate architectural community that still exists, there are people who follow, say, in the footsteps of, I'm sorry, there's construction going on in the house behind mine, so there'll be a lot of horrible noise that you might hear. There's people who follow in the footsteps of architects like, say, Laurie Baker, and others who work with both sustainable materials, but also in ways that adapt to climate and so on. So I think we can have a much more vigorous policy conversation among architects, among builders, where there is a way of making this mainstream and not treating it as something which is, and something only done by this fringe element within the community of builders and architects. I think, for instance, that a lot of, that it needs to be made much more prestigious, so this form of building. So that even large corporates take pride in having, office complexes, factories, workplaces, which actually do end up being energy efficient in the truest sense of the term, both in terms of building materials as well as in the way in which buildings are maintained and operated, and the ways in which people use them. And to be able to say that, we don't have air conditioning, except perhaps we use them only in the hottest days of summer or days of maximum humidity. I mean, that should be something that people take pride in. And I think it means reconnecting with our past, but in a way that is something which works for the future.
Yeah, thank you all. And there's a question here that sort of is a nice segue from everything we've just talked about. And this question was originally for Amita's presentation, but I think it's I'd like to ask it to all of you. And it is that, given these regionally specific strategies, that particularly the ones that Amita had talked about, how can other countries potentially learn from them? But more importantly, what is the likelihood that as a global community we can revert and retract this kind of thermal dependency that the AC has started? So I'd like to ask all of you to reflect on that, because that is in many ways the nub of what we want to get to. Because, you know, like we've all said, we're so easy to assume that cooling means air conditioning, but it doesn't, and for many reasons it shouldn't. And is there a way in which we can recover some of those non AC cooling mechanisms at scale, and how would we do that, among other things?
May I just say a few,
Please,
begin?
please, yeah.
Okay, these are just thoughts off the top of my head, and they're really speculative because the thing about most technological change is that it's very hard to reverse it. So one can therefore think in terms of how to best limit it and perhaps think of ways of leapfrogging over it. That something else comes along that's just way more efficient and way cooler or something. And therefore, you know, air conditioning gets made obsolete. But that's not for me to think about because I'm a sociologist. So I'll confine myself to the idea that perhaps what we need to do is recognize is, you know, take the idea of air conditioning on a very specific case by case basis to figure out exactly where it's essential and where one can do without it, and therefore discourage use appropriately. You know, if you have an intensive care unit in a hospital, yes, you do need ACs for all sorts of reasons. Um, well, I don't know about infections and anyway, that was just a random example. But there might be situations where one wants to prioritize public spaces being air conditioned and not others, not private ones. One might actually also think about ways in which there's a larger move away from the requirement of air conditioning by changing our urban landscapes, layouts, providing more attractive open air spaces. As I think at least one or two of the questions said, with the pandemic, now there's a new awareness that, you know, you're less likely to catch infections if you're in the open. So perhaps if, you know, those sorts of concerns stay for a longer period, we might change our relationship with the outdoors in terms of thermal comfort.
Yeah, I think just building on what Amita just said, I think India is at a very interesting point, right? Like we have very low levels of AC penetration right now, but as sort of we expect and as the projection shows, this is going to rise very rapidly. Currently, even in households that use AC, we find, which have ACs, we find the usage levels are still low compared to the developed world, right? So penetration is low, usage is low. And some of the work that has been presented today, I think all three presentations sort of hint at these passive adaptive methods of cooling that are very prevalent in Indian societies. And I think that is something that if we can identify the methods and promote them is something that can be something that I would say that India can take to the rest of the world, right? If we do it right first. So I think there's a lot of promise of promoting non-AC cooling practices. I think the work today shares, you know, what are some of the popular and acceptable practices. Like Ronita looked at what's acceptable to people. You know, whether it's opening doors and windows, having more natural ventilation, building it, integrating it in the building design. We find in our work that in Delhi that households that have ACs very often use electricity saving strategies. So they would sleep and occupy the room, the same room where the AC is on, so that they don't have to use multiple ACs. We talked about things like adjusting clothing, drinking cold beverages. I think it's an interesting, I would say, still an open question, like what's the right way to promote these things, because the aspirations and Amita mentioned the addictiveness to AC is also increasing. So I think something to brainstorm and think about, but definitely something we need to do is find out what these methods are, what is acceptable, and how do we promote them. as sort of an active cooling services that people can use other than ACs?
To answer your first question, how are these knowledges transferable across the world? I was very oblivious that I thought slum rehabilitation housing is just a part of the government of India's plan or started from Mumbai. And then I started slowly looking at the global south. And if you see Ethiopia, Latin America, Indonesia, South East Asia, all of them are having a very similar sort of a plan. Surprisingly, African cities, Ethiopian cities, they have a very similar sort of they call it a different name though. Surprisingly, they say that because the success of Mumbai's SRH is so high, and that they have been able to close the housing deficit, they have been able to remove slums, they have adopted exactly the same policy. So if you see now, go across the global south and look at these rehabilitation housing which are replacing slums, they're exact same 25 to 30 square meter multi-purpose unit with a toilet inside, and they look exactly same, like matchboxes placed one after the other, because that's the most optimized design you can get to have the maximum number of units. So it is, the methods are very easily translatable. However, there's this large question which Anna also raised, that and also Amita raised, that to understand this whole context of what cooling means to everybody, that whole contextual behavior, what feels warmer to somebody is not warmer to me, that we all know. So in order to have that understanding of cultural practices around these cooling demand or cooling preferences, that has to be imbibed in these in our probably empirical models, or probably in our simulation models, which currently if you see, we take a very static schedule and then we say this is the energy demand. That itself, if I had to look at, so I have looked, there's a study where we looked at the whole apartment building with same unit size, same socioeconomic status, almost similar assets. The energy variation was 87%. So that means each person living in the same sort of a climatic condition, having probably similar thermal history, can have different cooling demands and loads. And this sort of a variability is completely missing in the literature. And that's probably we should go towards, and that understanding those would probably help us to understand nudges that is required to shift this complete dependency, or making this air conditioning like a diamond ring for a society, especially for our global south community.
Yeah, thanks, Ronita. We have very similar findings where we looked at exactly the same type of housing block, same climate, people with the same assets, and
Absolutely.
the variation in behaviors is immense, and the behavior in energy consumption is immense when you have the bills from the utility itself. So it was not even self-reported that the role of behavior is it's neglected, and it really changes the outcomes that we're looking for. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, and what I'll do is I'll go back to the questions I received during your presentations and ask each of you one question, and then we can close. So Anna, there was an unanswered question from the time that you were presenting, and it is that the person says that this comes from personal experience, but every time I want to buy a star-rated appliance in Delhi, my local electrician is extremely against it because he's convinced that they burn out quicker due to poor quality of supply. What quality of supply is an option for households to choose from? And I'm just going to add to that question and say that, you know, what do we have to learn about the role of the local retailer? And I know in our study we're sort of looking into that. So could you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. As we find, most ACs are bought from a retail store. Second-hand ACs are sometimes bought from a local store or a friend or relative, but most of the ACs are bought from the retailer, and the retailer can have substantial influence on sort of the type of AC that someone buys. And while we were doing this study, we just went to some of these retailers, and you find that they do try to sort of push a specific star rating AC without, I think, having much back of the envelope calculations going on over there. I think better understanding of what drives the retailer to promote a specific brand or a star rating would be very helpful. We haven't done that in our study, but I think better understanding of what are the drivers and influencers behind sort of how distributors and retailers can influence the choice, and intervening at that point can really help drive the right selection of the star rating for a particular household.
Great, thank you. Amita, there was a question when you were presenting, which I think is interesting. So the person asked, in later stages of your research, will you be able to differentiate between comfort tolerance and consumerism? It's up to you to define each of those terms.
Yeah. Well, consumerism is a tricky word because it means drawing an arbitrary line between what is necessary and sufficient and what is excessive. And that line is something which is which is not set by individuals, because there's, as we know, no consumer is sovereign. It's actually set by the larger capitalist structure within which we live. So what might have seemed like a luxury to a previous generation now seems like an absolute necessity to a younger generation. So I think it's a very complex matter where one draws that line, and the way in which that line is shaped by these larger forces, where you have the slew of advertising that tells you, "Oh, go on, pamper yourself, you deserve it. Spend more money because you're worth it." So consumerism is something that one has to consciously recognize as a presence in one's life, and then be aware of how choices are shaped by these larger forces. And that can only happen when there is a far larger conversation around usage, around wastage, and the ways in which these decisions are made at different levels for us. So this is part of course, a far wider conversation about how we live our lives, how we spend our money, how we make money, what we throw away, what we use. So, this particular focus on energy has to be part of that uh, larger process of looking at these lines carefully, being conscious that they exist, and then asking ourselves, well, who's drawing them for us? How are our choices being shaped by other people, by other institutions, by markets, by governments, and so on?
Great, thank you. So Ronita, the last question for you, and because it's strange to talk for 2 hours and not talk about COVID. So the question is, will AC cooling patterns shift post-COVID? I have seen people switching off the car and office and home ACs and opening windows during the last few months. So I know this doesn't necessarily draw from this particular research of yours, but it was asked during your presentation.
Yes, I did not present that work here. We did see exactly very similar patterns. The energy demand in typically I wouldn't say low income, in one bedroom apartments increased almost threefolds in comparison to previous years, just during COVID, especially during the working hours. And that's a very big surprise, I would say. So I can't show you the data as of now. It's not in my computer, but the graph is startlingly different. In previous years, it had a very similar trend of a very low energy consumption, probably a static energy consumption that you would see when there is nobody in the house. Whereas it was clearly shown during the COVID times, the energy consumption had gone up almost threefolds in non-peak hours, which was not a peak hour if you would have to define from our previous years. And yes, so I would suggest, I would say, so in contrast, so I was in India during the when the lockdown happened and all that, and then I got stuck there for quite some time, and then when I came back here, there's a little difference. There is this whole sort of understanding that if you switch on air conditioner in your homes, you're going to bring in the COVID disease inside. So there is a huge, I think, there's a lot of houses which have actually switched off their air conditioners during the very hotter months, which we were into lockdown in during this time. Whereas when I came
Where was
here,
this? Where
this
was
was in,
this?
so I was locked down in Mumbai and then in Kolkata. So
No, the
both,
study about the increase, the jump. Where is that from?
In India as well as US. So both the countries. So they did see a huge jump. So when I came back to the UK, this whole understanding that you can't have active cooling or active heating, rather cooling, I would say, was not there. So it was not correlated to COVID at all. Whereas in India, this sort of thing has kind of permeated that if you are in an air conditioned space, you're probably the chances of getting infection is higher. So that's why I said this is probably a very big nudge that has created the sudden decrease in the cooling demand. But probably if this sort of there are certain nudges which are probably non-existent currently in uptaking of rated appliances, and that probably needs to be more looked at.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we're almost out of time. Thank you all so much. This was really wonderful. And all three presentations focused on understanding the social and behavior drivers of cooling and how this pans out. We have more tomorrow. So same time, we're going to have 3 more new presentations. And tomorrow, we're going to focus on the efficacy of policies and programs that are directed towards cooling. So, there's always a laundry list of all the policies that exist, but we're focused on, what does it mean in terms of actual implementation. So the lineup is as wonderful as today's, and do join us. And like I had said before, this has been live streamed, it's been recorded, there's lots of live tweeting going on. So we'll share all of that with you and for everyone who has registered. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining. And I'm sorry I don't have a chorus of applause, but I'll do it at my end. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Radhika.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.